Imagine a land where everything seems to be going fine. Cities are full of trade, markets are busy, caravans are moving back and forth, and people believe the world will always stay this calm. At that time, Iran was under the Khwarezmian Empire, a large and powerful state that considered itself strong, maybe even too strong. But the real problem was exactly that: pride. The ruling king, instead of focusing on external threats and borders, was more involved in internal power struggles and personal ambition. On the surface, everything looked stable, but underneath that strength, dangerous cracks were forming. And on the other side of the world, a name was slowly rising: Genghis Khan. At first, no one took him seriously, a tribal leader with a cavalry army. But what made the Mongols dangerous wasn't just their swords, it was their speed, their brutality, and most importantly, the fact that nothing seemed to stop them. The first spark of disaster started very simply, maybe simpler than you think.
When Genghis Khan heard this news, he did not stay silent. And that silence was more terrifying than any scream. First, he sent envoys. He demanded, "Hand over the responsible ones, and we will not harm your people." But what was the response? Disrespect, pride, and another wrong decision. And that was when the storm began. The Mongols moved like nothing the world had ever seen before. Fast, ruthless, precise. City after city fell. Resistance was broken or simply crushed. The first blows felt like a shock. People still could not believe this was not an ordinary war. This was a wave that erased everything in its path. Cities fell not just through battle, but through fear. In many places, people didn't even get the chance to fight back. Just escape. Just hope there was somewhere safe. But the bitter truth was this: there was no safe place. Bukhara fell, a city once known as a center of knowledge and culture. Nishapur, one of the greatest cities of that era, was completely destroyed. According to historical accounts, the devastation was so severe that even generations later, people still feared the name of that city. And this was not just a war, it was a complete collapse. Civilizations built over centuries were destroyed in a very short time. In the middle of this disaster, a strange feeling spread: helplessness. People didn't know what to trust anymore. The army? It was falling apart. The government? Confused. Hope? Slowly fading away. Genghis Khan had only one goal: to completely break the power that had insulted him. And in that path, there were no limits. Every falling city felt like another piece of Iran's history was being erased. Books, markets, homes, everything turned upside down. But maybe the most painful part of the story was this: this disaster was not only the result of Mongol swords, it was also the result of previous political mistakes. Pride, mismanagement, and ignoring a threat that was already approaching. When the dust of war settled, what remained was not just ruins, it was a heavy silence. A silence that showed an entire era had ended. From a powerful empire, Iran turned into a wounded land that would take years to recover. And perhaps the most important question this story leaves us with is, was the enemy always the cause of the fall? Or sometimes, do our own mistakes open the door to disaster? And now we continue the story, the part where everyone thought it was over, but in beginning.
If you think the fall of a few cities and the retreat of armies ended everything, you are deeply wrong, because the Mongols had just learned how to completely empty a land, not just conquer it. After the first wave of attacks, something strange happened. Cities were no longer just falling, they were disappearing. It wasn't only walls collapsing or battles taking place anymore. The entire structure of life was breaking apart. Markets shut down, trade routes became unsafe, villages were abandoned. The Mongols had a way of war that people in Iran at that time could not understand. They didn't just come to fight, they came to finish things completely. Meaning if a city resisted, after its fall it wouldn't just be defeated, it would become a message. A very simple message: submit or face total destruction. And this is where real fear started spreading among the remaining cities. In some places, there wasn't even a battle anymore. People would open the gates themselves out of fear. But the problem was, the Mongols didn't always come for surrender. Sometimes they came for punishment.
One of the darkest parts of historical accounts is that after some of these city falls, the destruction was so severe that even the names of those cities changed in memory over generations. It was as if they were erased from the map. Now imagine for a moment a traveller passing through those lands years later. Where there once was a city, now there is only ruins. No market sounds, no people, only wind. At this point, the war is technically over, but its effects are still alive. On the other side, the Khwarezmian government was collapsing from within as well. The king, who once thought this was just a border conflict, now found himself in the middle of a full-scale crisis. Commanders were not coordinated, cities acted independently, and this allowed the Mongols to consume everything one by one. This is exactly the moment where history becomes cruel, when the enemy is not necessarily stronger, but you are already broken from within. The Mongols exploited these cracks. They didn't want long, exhausting wars. They attacked fast, destroyed fast, and moved on just as quickly, as if nothing could slow them down. And perhaps the most terrifying part was that no one knew where they would strike next. This meant every city could become the next target at any moment.
On the other side, the Khwarezmian government was collapsing from within as well. The king, who once thought this was just a border conflict, now found himself in the middle of a full-scale crisis. Commanders were not coordinated, cities acted independently, and this allowed the Mongols to consume everything, one by one. This is exactly the moment where history becomes cruel, when the enemy is not necessarily stronger, but you are already broken from within. The Mongols exploited these cracks. They didn't want long, exhausting wars. They attacked fast, destroyed fast, and moved on just as quickly, as if nothing could slow them down. And perhaps the most terrifying part was that no one knew where they would strike next. This meant every city could become the next target at any moment. In some places, historical accounts suggest that people would flee even before the Mongols arrived, just by hearing their name. Fear had arrived before the army itself. And here a harsh truth becomes clear. This war was not only won by swords, it was won by fear. As we move further into the story, the picture becomes clearer. A great empire not only facing an external invasion, but also collapsing under its own internal weaknesses and mistakes. And the Mongols were simply the final force that broke everything open.
Now we reach the point where the story is no longer just tragic. It becomes the peak of catastrophe. If you thought the worst had already happened, this final part shows that the Mongols had entered a stage where they were no longer just conquering cities. They were erasing them completely and leaving behind a permanent trace of fear. One of the most famous and devastating events is tied to the city of Nishapur. At that time, Nishapur was not just an ordinary city. It was a major center of science, culture, and civilization. A place where people believed they were safe, where generations had built their lives. But when the Mongols arrived, everything changed. Historical accounts suggest that the resistance was extremely intense. People fought.
After Nishapur, a wave of fear spread across the entire region. No one was asking who will win anymore. Everyone was asking, when will it be our turn? The Mongols had now fully learned how to control an empire without needing to fight everywhere. Fear itself had become an army. Many cities were abandoned even before the Mongols arrived. People fled, commanders were confused, and the government had no clear direction on how to respond.